Hilchis Tumas Ochlin Perik Shlishis. Here the Rambam is mamshich in the dinim of how oichel is mekabel tumah. First of all, it has to be muksher lekabel tumah, and the way to be muksher lekabel tumah through the fact that one of the zayin mashkin fell on this oichel birtzainoi. That's one din, and also that it has to be an oichel which is meyuchel l'maychel adam. If it's not meyuchel l'maychel adam, so then it doesn't have a din oichel which is mekabel tumah. Perik Shlishi. Kvar biarnu sheino oichlin mistamin achi yuchsheru. So it has to be yuchsheru, which means through mashkin falling on it, and one of the zayin mashkin and bersene, and also v'shekol eichel sheini meyuchad l'maychel adam eini mekabel tuma achi yichadei l'adam. If you have food, but it's not really meyuchad l'maychel adam, it doesn't have a din of meichel until you are yichadei l'adam. Now oicha beis eichel shemeyuchad l'adam mokim hazeh. So the din is b'makim shum yochud be in that place where it's regular. People eat this food. Is eini tzarach machshava liyachtei l'adam. It's considered miyuchad l'adam, and therefore it's bepashtus mekabel tumah. However, b'makim she'eini miyuchad be, in the place over there it's not miyuchad be. So in order for it to be mekabel tumah there, tzarach machshava liyachtei l'adam. You have machshava. You need machshava liyachtei l'adam. And only then will it be mekabel tumah. And that's din number one, and that'll be negeh. We'll learn behemshich in the next halacha benegeh krachim and kvarim that they eat different things. So mele what's considered miyuchad l'maychel adam in a krach won't necessarily be in a kvar, and that is what's in a kvar is not necessarily in a kvar. That's din number one, and then there's another din. V'chol oichel sheseifi l'tami adam v'kelim. An oichel, which eventually, in other words, if it'll be a share of a kezayas, will be able to be metami odom v'kelim any tzarech hechsher. So that's what we're going to learn b'negeya a nevela or nivlas eifator, which even though it's less than a kezayas, so memela it's not really b'metami als nevela, but now the question is, could it be metami als oichel, tumas ochlin? In other words, if an oichel, if something tummy touches it, should have a din of tumas ochlin. This nevela or niflas eifator. So now we're going to learn that since it's seifi l'tami tumah chamura, it's shaychus alza kezayas to be metami alza nevela or niflas eifator. So therefore, it's ain't tzarech hechsher. It's mekabel tumas eichlin even without hechsher. That's what we're going to learn behemshich in the next halach. Halacha gimel. Now, yesh the Rambam is going to give us four categories. Yesh oichlin shetzrichim. Halacha gimel. Yesh oichlin shetzrichem hechsher ve'einon tzrichem machshava. There are those types of foods that need hechsher. You have to be machsher l'kabel tumah through having water fall on it, or one of the zayin mashkin. Aber ve'einon tzrichem machshava. They're dvarim which are miyuchadim l'adam, which is really the pashtus dekeifen. A pashtus dekeifen. You have food, so the food has a din of food. It's miyuchad l'adam, but on the other end, it's tzarech hechsher. Now v'yesh shetzrichem machshava ve'einon tzrichem hechsher. There's a mitzvah of food that doesn't need hechsher. That's we're going to learn something that's seifi l'tama tumah l'tami odem v'kelim is ain't tzarech hechsher. But on the other end, it's tzarech machshava, and v'yesh tzricha machshava v'hechsher. They need machshava v'hechsher, which would also be like regular. There's food which is not mamish miyuchad l'adam. It's food that a person could eat, but it's not miyuchad l'adam. And on the other end, it's tzarech hechsher. And v'yesh einam tzricha le machshava v'lehechsher. Like we learn behemshech. The havanas advarim is, let's just go over the bepashtus. A regular food, knows it's miyuchad la'adam, is ain't a tzarech machshava, but it needs hechsher. A food which is not a regular, it's not mamish pashtus that you're going to eat it, so it needs machshava and hechsher. That's l'chura, the two pashut ways. Now we're learning there's a musik called that something that doesn't need hechsher. How does something doesn't need hechsher? Pashta, the only way it doesn't need hechsher is because it's safer l'tamei tumah chamura. Now, in those things gufa, which is safer l'tamei tumah chamura, is it bepashtus and oichel? So it's ein tzarech machshava and ein tzarech hechsher, or no, it's not a pashtus dike food. So memela it's tzarech machshava in order to make it miyuchad l'adam, but on the other end, it's ein tzarech hechsher because lepeil is safer l'tamei tumah chamura. That's what the Rambam is going to go through in all the pratim in this sif. Case. Kol ha'eichlim am yuchadim la'adam. A regular oichel which is yuchadim la'adam b'chol makim is tzricha hechsher. It needs hechsher in order for it to be makabel tumah, it has to have that the zayin mashkin fell on it. But they don't need machshava because they're bepashtus roy lachilas adam, miyuchad lachilas adam. Mashul dogim teherim v'chagavim teherim b'chol mokim. They're all miyuchad la'adam. And v'chagavim tmeim v'dogim tmeim b'kvarim is hareim yuchadim la'adam. It's nice in kvarim people eat chagavim tmeim and dogim tmeim. That's normal. In the ear over there, people are maybe more edel, more sophisticated. So in Mela, for them, they wouldn't normally eat chagavim tmeim and dogim tmeim. So for them, in order for it to have a din of an oichel, it has to be miyuch, it has to have machshava. So again, v'chagavim tmeim v'dogim tmeim b'kvarim is hareim yuchadim la'adam, and therefore it's only v'tzorech hechsher, but v'lei machshava. V'chein chelev behema tehera shemesa. A chelev of a behema tehera shemesa, so it's also a tzarech hechsher, it needs hechsher. Now if it wasn't mesa, if it was nishchata, it doesn't need hechsher because the shchita was machsheret. The shchita itself was machsheret. But if it wasn't, there was no shchita. So in Mele, the point is over here that chelev of a behema tehera is something which is normal to eat. Chelev behema tehera shemesa is tzarech hechsher, v'lei machshava b'chol makom. So these are the cases where the Rambam says things that ain't a tzarech machshava, but tzarech hechsher. And one of them was the dogim, and chagavim tmeim, and dogim tmeim bekfarim, because over there it's miyuchad la'adam, as opposed to in other places, not in the kfar, in the ear, so over there it's not miyuchad la'adam. Ve'elu tzrichen machshava ve'hechsher. These are the ones that tzrichen machshava ve'hechsher because they're not bepashtus miyuchad la'adam. Now, basar ha'perish min achai, if you have basar that was perish min achai, so that basar is not metame. There's a din of an eva min achai is metame, but basar ha'perish min achai is not metame, and that basar ha'perish min achai is also not stomi lachila. It's not stomi lachila. So basar ha'perish min achai, bein min ha'odam, bein min ha'beim, bein min ha'of, is not stomi lachila. So therefore, it needs machshava and hechsher. Needs machshava and hechsher. And also v'nivla so eifatomi. On eifatomi, the nevel of an eifatomi, it's not metame, so therefore it's tzarech hechsher, and also it's tzarech machshava, because on eifatomi is not a normal thing to eat. V'chelev behemet teira shchuta b'kvarim. Now we learned before that the chelev of a behemet teira shemesa is b'chol mokim is not tzarech machshava. That's something that's considered an eichel b'chol mokim. A chelev behema teira shchuta, Weißus in kvar is considered more of an expensive item. I don't really understand. L'mayin of kimin if the chelev was shchuta or not shchuta. We're talking about chelev. But I'll call upon if a behema teira shchuta b'kvar is something like it's too expensive for the anshe akvar to normally eat. So normally it wouldn't be miyuchad l'adam. Is afal and so l'chura that explains why it's tzarech machshava. But why should it need hechsher? L'chura b'chlal things. The basar, everything in a behema becomes huchsher with the shchita. So he says, "Afal pisha huchsher b'shchita is tzarech hechsher sheni achra machshava." Nor since the pashtus is when you're shechting it, so that chelev is not oimed lachila for the anshe akvar. So now when the anshe akvar are going to eat it for them in akvar for it to be considered an oichel is a chidush. So after you shechted it. So you had to you couldn't have a machshava before the shchita. The machshava is going to have to be after the shchita. And after the shchita, you can have a machshava that this chelev is going to have a din of oichel. Now it gets a din of oichel, so now it needs hechsher. The hechsher that it had before, it got a din of oichel doesn't help. It didn't help, and that machshava won't help while it's still before the shchita. As we're going to learn by Hamshach, machshava l'mashal, when something is mechuber, can't change the status of something that's mechuber. Al derech zeh, the machshava of this chelev, which is in the behema, before it's geshachten, can't change the status. At this point in time, when you shech the behema, so this chelev is chelev, which the pashtus is not miyuchad la'adam in akvar. Now, when you go ahead and you want to be miyachad la'adam b'kvar, so it's a new dover that you became miyuchad la'adam, and now it needs hechsher. That's what he's saying. Aval b'shehuchsher b'shchita, tzarech hechsher sheni achra machshava. Ush'ar kol yirakis asada, other yirakis, kin apsolim akoshem b'yeser, hard onions or vapitrias and mushrooms, v'chein chagovim v'dogim ktanim, all these things is tzrichim machshava b'kvarim. So psadin bekvarim. In kvarim, it's we're finding that there are certain things that are eaten bekvarim and that are not eaten bekrachim. Like we learned before, benegeh chagavim tmeim, medogim tmeim bekvarim. They're eaten bekvarim. Masha'enkin and krachim, they would need machshava. And over here is fakert. Over here, the yarkis asada and the psolim hakoshim b'yeser. So in the kvarim, they're not normally eaten la'adam. They're not normally eaten la'adam. And in order for them to be eaten la'adam, these things, in a kvar, you need machshava. You need machshava. That's you have to know what the Seder Advarim is. In a kvar, there's more available. In a certain way, in a kvar, there's more available. So since there's more available, so they don't really have to eat psolim hakoshim b'yeser and pitris and chagavim dogim ktanim, because there's more available. On the other hand, there's certain things that are richer, are more expensive, and memela, that's not really going to be for the kvar. That'll be more for the anshe hakrach. Then the Rambam continues, ulshin shezarnu lebehema. Ulshin normally translated endives, that you were zirei lebehema, and then v'nimlach aleim la'adam, and then you change your mind that you want it to be la'adam, is eina mekabel tuma ad sheyachshav aleim achar sheyitlushu. In other words, this changing your mind of what you planted it for could only happen ad chashiyitlushu, not while it's still growing. Shemachshava is chibur eina machshava, because the machshava that you have while it's mechuber is eina machshava. Now ulshin shalikton lebehemtei, and then vehidichon, after you are likton lebehemtei, you are hidichei, you made it wet. You and then v'nimlach aleim la'adam is tzarich hechsher sheni achar machshava. Because you went ahead and you had these ulshin which you planted lebehema, and then you picked it lebehema, and then you made it wet while it was still machshava lebehema, and now you want to do it la'adam. So you can't say, well, it was wet already, and memela was muksha lekabel tumah. No, it has to become muksha lekabel tumah after it's miyuchad l'maychel adam. Like we learned before, benegeh the chaylev of the behemoth hater shchuta b'kvarim, you have to have a new hechsher. The shchita doesn't help, because that shchita happened before you were miyachad l'adam. V'chein kol ki yetzeh baseh. Now halal is when you take off the skin of the animal, and there's some pieces of flesh stuck to the skin. Is a mchishav olav la'achila. If you had in mind that you're going to eat it, so then it's mekabel tumas ochlin. V'imlav is hareu ke'etz and ve'eini mekabel tumah. V'cheinu atzomis hamuchubarim bebasar. These are telling all things that are. The question is whether or not they have a din of oichel or not. So you need machshav in order to make him into a neichel. V'cheinu atzomis hamuchubarim bebasar. The atzomis which are connected to the meat, or v'hagidim, or sinews, v'hamkemes harakim and akarnaim and atlafayim, v'haknafayim, v'hanoitza. There's all these places which we learned earlier that they don't really have a din of nevela. All these places, nevela was only basar. These mekemes harakim, even the part of the horns which stick into the flesh, and that's really soft, or the tlafayim, or the hooves, or the knafayim are the wings, not the wings, the feathers, and vanutza are also very thin type of feathers. Vahamkemes harakim minatzi parnayim, from the nails, uminachartum, and from the beak, hamuvloim babasar, which is absorbed by the flesh. So in other words, we're talking about these pieces of the animal or of the birds that are really not, normally they're not basar, but lepel, they're surrounded by basar, and they're also soft, and if you cut them, blood will come out. So in order for them to become a din of oichel, is tzrichim hechsher machshava. They need hechsher machshava. So these are the things that we learned before. So again, there were certain things that need hechsher, but not machshava. These are things that are bepashtus lachila. And then there are certain things that need hechsher and also machshava. Why do they need machshava? They need machshava because they're not pashtus lachilus adam. So the Rambam is giving us a whole list of things that are not bepashtus lachilus adam, not bepashtus lachilus adam. So we had, let's say, in a kvar, a chel of a behema tehera. That's what one thing we had, a din that's not bepashtus lachilus adam. Then we also had the chagavim, the dogim ktanim, which are tzrichim machshava in kvarim. And then there's also situations where you planted it for a behema. Now you need a machshava in order to make it l'tzerich adam, and then we're learning about things that are in the behema, which are like the part of the nails, which are cut of lebasser, which are soft, could be edible, but it's not normally eaten. Alderas and the hooves, or these things which are soft, and they're in the basar, so they're not really basar, and therefore they don't have a din of basar, just like we learned before, they don't have a din of tumas nevela. But on the other hand, in order that shishmimekabel tumas echlin, machshava would work. But all of these things need hechsher, because lepel, they need hechsher. Ve'elu she'en tzichem le machshava v'le hechsher. So until now we spoke about those things that need hechsher. The reason they need hechsher, the pasta that needs hechsher. And on the other, the question is, does it need machshava? It doesn't need machshava. Is if it's bepashtus lachilas odom, so then it doesn't need machshava. And if it's not so bepashtus, that it's machshava lachilas odom, or in this place, it's not so bepashtus that it's lachilas odom, so then it doesn't need machshava. But both of them need hechsher. Now we're going to talk about two afanim that it doesn't need hechsher. Now, why shouldn't something need hechsher? So we learned before, the reason why it doesn't need hechsher is because it's sefer l'tamis tumas adam v'kelim. If something which will eventually be matami doesn't need hechsher. But on the other hand, does it need machshava or not? That depends. If it's bepashtus lachilas adam, that's what we're going to learn here. Ve'elu she'ein tzrichim le machshava v'le hechsher. It doesn't need not machshava, not hechsher. And before even we learn further, we understand that the reason why it doesn't need machshava is because it's bepashtus lachilas adam. And the reason why it doesn't need hechsher is because it's safer l'tamei tumas adam. Now ve'elu she'en tzrichim le machshava v'le hechsher. So the first is nivlas behema teira b'chol makim. The nevela of a behema teira doesn't need machshava because it's bepashtus edible, of something la'adam, and it doesn't need hechsher. And also the nivlas eifator is also bepashtus for achila. And now the lashon haram over here is v'chelev behema temeir bakrachim. It's corrected to say v'chelev behema teira shchuta bakrachim. The chelev, which is very different. The chelev behema teira shchuta bakrachim. The chelev of a behema teira shchuta. So we learned before that the chelev of a behema shchuta bikfarim does need machshava. Masha'inkin, a chelev of behema teira shchuta bikrachim doesn't need machshava. Why not? Lefi sheim yuchadim l'maychal adam. So since now lefi sheim yuchadim l'maychal adam goes on all three, on the nivlas behema tehera, the nivlas eifator, and the chelev behema shchuta bikrachim. Behema tehera shchuta bikrachim. Lefi sheim yuchadim l'maychal adam. So therefore, ein echad me'ela from all these three is tzarech machshava. And the einon tzrichen hechsher, this little, why don't they need a hechsher? Mipnei sheseif l'tami adam v'kelim b'kezayis. Because since we're dealing with an avela, so an avela is sefer l'tami adam v'kelim b'kezayis. Now, as we'll learn b'hamshach, l'chura, if we're talking about tumas nevela, what's in the gale? We have tumas echlin. L'chura, if it's already tami tumas nevela. The answer is because it's only matami b'kezayis, alts an avela, when it's a kezayis. A kezayis of an avela is matami. Less than a kezayis is not matami. Masha'inkin tumas echlin, it could have a din of tumas echlin, even without a kezayis. So tumas echlin matami b'kolshu. In memela, so therefore it's negeh to know tumas echlin. Even though tumas echlin is not matami, only it's a kibetza, but then it could be started for those. Once this thing gets a din of tumas echlin, so it could be started with something else which is tami echlin, kedei l'tami, or we'll learn b'hamshach. But the point is, what's in the gay over here that it's matame tumas echlin? L'chur, it's already matame tumas nevela, which is much more chomer than tumas echlin. The answer is because if it's a pachas mikazayis, it's not matame tumas nevela, and it can still be matame tumas echlin if it was mekabel tumas echlin. That's what he's saying. Ve'enon tzrichen hechsher mipnei sheseif l'tami adam v'kelim mikazayis. And the rule is v'chol matame tumah chamura is eini tzarech hechsher. It doesn't need hechsher. So that's the din of these that don't need machshava and don't need hechsher. Now the ma'aseh is one of the things that we said according to the change in girsa is the chelev behema shchuta tehera shchuta bikrachim. Now the din is the chelev of a behema tehera shchuta or even not shchuta is not mekabel tumah, is not metame. The chelev is not metame. That we learn out from the pasuk that yasol l'chol malacha the chelev velo trefe yasol l'chol malacha. So the chelev of a behema tehera is not metame. So l'chura, how are we saying over that seif from l'tami adam v'kelim? So you're going to have to say over here that over here the reason why doesn't need hechsher is because it already got hechsher through the shchita. not so glottic in Rambam, but lepel, that's l'chura the pshat. That since it's already received hechsher by shchita, we're talking about a chelev of a behemoth tehera shchuta b'krachim. So it already received hechsher through the shchita. So therefore, it doesn't need another hechsher. That's this thing. So this was talking about something that didn't need not machshava, not hechsher. Ve'elu tzricha machshava, ve'enu tzricha hechsher. Nivla so efator b'kfarim. The nevela of an efator b'kfarim also. So in a kfar, that's not something which is eaten by people. Vice is also, it's something which is too dear for them to eat. Nivla so efator b'kfarim. And the nivlas behemoth tmeya b'chol makim. An nevela of a behemoth tmeya is not miyuchad la'adam. And in order for it to have a din of being mekabel Tumas Ochlin, it has to be that there was machshava. That was machshava. Now, v'hu, this whole din is shechishav al pachim b'kezayis. Aval kezayis avatoma. Who knows, if we're dealing with a kezayis, so what's in the gay over here? For yel mekabel Tumas Ochlin, I'm mekabel Tumas Ochlin, it's the chana avatoma. So we have to be talking about something that's not a kezayis. So Mimela, it's not an avatoma. And Mimela, there's a deal whether or not it was mekabel Tumas Ochlin, and we're saying, in order to be mekabel Tumas Ochlin, it doesn't need hechsher, because seifei l'tami odem v'kelim b'kezayis doesn't need machshava. So it depends. If we're talking about something was bepashtus lachila, so it doesn't need machshava, it doesn't need hechsher, and it doesn't need machshava. And if it's not bepashtus lachila, it doesn't need machshava. So nekudas advarim is that the basic of the din is azoi. In order for something to need machshava, it has to be that's bepashtus. It's not lachila, or in this place it's bepashtus, not lachila. Either in the krach it's bepashtus, not lachila, or in the kfar it's not bepashtus lachila. So it needs machshava. If it's bepashtus yel lachila, it doesn't need machshava. Now what about hechsher? So hechsher, it always needs hechsher. So normally something needs hechsher, and it needs hechsher after it's considered a noichel. It's not enough to have hechsher and then it have a din machshava. The hechsher has to be after it was miyuchad to be a noichel. After it was miyuchad to be a noichel, only then does the hechsher help. Now, what about, there are certain things that doesn't need hechsher. If it's seifi l'tama, tuma of odem v'kelim, l'mashal and avela, or alderaz and nivlas eifator, so memela over there, since it's seifi l'tama tumas nevela, so memela, so therefore it doesn't need hechsher. That's this thing. Halacha Dalet. Yisrael sheshachad behemoth tmeil lenochri. A yid shechted a behemoth tmeil lenochri. The emes is that there's no musig of shchita by a behemoth tmeil. The whole musig of shchita is only by a behemoth teira. And when a yid shechts a behemoth teira, so then that behemoth, even though behemoth is mefarcheses, so legabi other places other dinim would have a din of being alive. But since lepel the yid shechted, there was a din of a shchita ksheira, so therefore it gets a din of a oichel and it becomes mutter bachila. That's a chidush b'negei behemoth teira, which was nishchata kalocha. Now that din doesn't apply to a behemoth tmeya that was nishchata because there's no musig of nishchata. It also doesn't apply to a goy that shechts a behemoth teira because a goy shechting a behemoth teira doesn't either have a din of shchita legabi heter achila. The din of shchita doesn't apply to a goy that shechts a behemoth teira. We learned that the Rambam held that b'negei tumah there is a din of a goy shechting, that there does the fact that it's tamei even if a goy shechted is only midrabanan. The Ravid argued, but b'negei achila everyone agrees that the shchita of an akum doesn't help at all. So, but now we're learning over here some new din that when a yid shechts a behemoth tmeya, or if a goy shechts a behemoth tehera, so there's a certain din that it gets a din of oichel. That even though it's mefarchesed, now when behemoth is alive, it's not mekabel tumah. Behemoth alive can't be mekabel tumah. Behemoth can only be mekabel tumah after it dies and it becomes oichel. Now the question is, a behemoth tehera that was shechted through a yid becomes oichel. It becomes roy lachila, so melas mekabel tumah. Masha'inkin, a behemoth tmeya that was shechted by a yid, or behemoth tehera that was shechted by a goy, l'chura is not a din oichel. It's not really oichel because there was no din shchita. And it's mefarcheses, it's still alive. And therefore it's not matamid tumas nevela. But on the other hand, there's a din, a din derabanan, that it should have a din of oichel and it's mekabel tumah. That's what we're learning over now, Halacha Dalet. Yisrael sheshachad behemoth tehemeya lenochri. A yid shechted a behemoth tehemeya lenochri. And v'shachad b'shnayim b'reiv shnayim. So it's a chidush harezu mistamed Tumas Ochlin kol zman she mefarcheses. While it's being mefarcheses and it's not yet an avela, it's yater and nevela, so it becomes Tomei Tumas Ochlin. And ve'ena tzricha machshava, it doesn't need machshava, l'chura, why not? L'chura, we learned before that a behemoth tmeya does need machshava, so that the answer is ve'ena tzricha machshava, shari Yisrael shochta lachilas agoy, because since the Yid shechted it lachilas agoy, ve'en lecha machshava g'dei lemizu, so that was in itself the machshava. That's why it doesn't need machshava. And ve'ena tzricha hechsher, why doesn't need a hechsher? Lefisha seifa l'tamei tumah chamura, because lepel is going to be tamei tumas nevela. So Memela was saying over there that Yisrael sheshachad behemoth tmeya l'nochri, and adayin befarcheses, it's mistamei tumas Ochlin, and it doesn't need machshava and it doesn't need hechsher. Now shachad ba'echad, if he didn't shech both simonim, but he was shachad ba'echad, a shenachru, he just stabbed it. So then ain't a tamei tumas Ochlin. It's not a tamei tumas Ochlin. It doesn't have a din of an eichel. It has a din of a behemoth shemefarcheses. So the behemoth shemefarcheses has the din that it's still alive. So Mevela doesn't have a din of an eichel. And then when it dies, it's going to have a din of an nevela. And then through machshava, it can become eichel. But at this point in time, it's not eichel. That's talking about a yid, shechter, a behemoth, tmeya for a goy. Now, if I care, v'chein goy, sheshachet behemoth teirel Yisrael, a goy shechter, the behemoth teirel Yisrael, and v'shachet b'shnayim b'reif shnayim, is again, is mistami tumas Ochlin, kol zman shima farcheses. Even though be'emes, it's not a shchita, so it's l'chura, the behemoth still alive. And ve'ena tzricha hechsher, it's not tzricha hechsher, because it's safer l'tamei tumah chamura, even though it's only going to be the safer tamei tumah chamura once it's going to become uis mefarcheses. At this point in time, it's not really b'tamei tumah chamura, but nevertheless, it also goes into the gather of safer l'tamei tumah chamura. Now shachad b'yachra inachra is eina b'tamei tumas Ochlin, marei kishar and nevelas. It's a regular din of a nevela and the mela, so there was no shchita here. So mela, the din is a behema which was stabbed, for example, and it was mefarcheses, so it's still alive until it actually dies, and then it has a din of a tumas nevela. Halacha hey, hachoitech basar me'ever menachai shel behema. In other words, there was an ever menachai is the chmatami, but basar menachai is not matami, and basar from the ever menachai is also not matami. Is hachoitech basar me'ever menachai shel behema. And now you decided that you're going to eat it, which we said before that a basar menachai is tzarech machshava. So over here, chishav is tzarech hechsher. So now you need a hechsher. You need to be machsher it after it was cut off als basar menachai. Now chishav acharka chotchei, while it was an eva menachai, you decided to eat it, and then it was chotchei. So then is einich tzarech hechsher. Why? Mipnei shemetame tumah chamura kenevela. In other words, while this basar was part of this Eva Menachai, so the question is Azay, while this basar was part of the Eva Menachai was Matami. Now, but the question is, did it have a din of Oichel? So if he was Choshev Oleh Lachila on this Eva Menachai, so Meiler has a din of Oichel, and on the other hand, this Oichel doesn't need Hechsher, because Seifel L'Tamei Tumah Chamura, so it's Oichel which could be Mekabel Tumah. So Meiler, since it's Oichel which is Mekabel Tumah, so Meiler it doesn't need Hechsher even after you cut it off. Masha'en Ken, if you cut it off before it had a din Oichel, so now, and after you cut it off, it's not Seifel L'Tamei Tumah Chamura, because this basar is not L'Tamei Tumah Chamura, so Meiler is Tzarech Hechsher. Again, if you have a Eva Menachai, and that Eva Menachai is the Sefer L'Tamei Tumah Chamura, Mela, if it had a din of basar, in other words, it had a din of Oichel, while it was still part of the Eva Menachai, so Mela doesn't need Hechsher, because it's Oichel, which is already Muksher L'Kabel Tumah. Now, if you cut off part of this Eva Menachai, so it's still Oichel, which is Muksher L'Kabel Tumah. It's not Matami, the Oichel is not Matami, but it's already Muksher L'Kabel Tumah because it was part of the Eva Menachai, which had a din of Oichel and had a din of being Muksher L'Kabel Tumah. Masha'en Ken, if while it was part of the Eva Menachai, it wasn't Oichel, so there was never a din of Oichel that's Muksher, and now it was taken off from the Eva Menachai, and now it gets a din of Oichel, because now you had Machshava to make it into Oichel, so now you need a new Hechsher, and the fact that it was once part of the Eva Menachai is not going to make a Hechsher now, so now you have to have Hechsher. Halacha Vav. Now we learned that something which is Sefer L'Tamei Odem V'Kelim, even Mashal right now it's less than the Kazayas, but Sefer L'Tamei Odem V'Kelim B'Kazayas, so Memele, that causes that it shouldn't need to be Muksher L'Kabel Tumah. So if it's something which is miyuchad la'adam, or it's you made a machshava and you miyachad la'adam, and it's seifi l'tamei tumah, which is adam v'kelim, it doesn't need a machshava in order to mekabel, it doesn't need hechsher in order to mekabel tumas ochlin. Now we're learning another din. Now something could be mekabel tumas ochlin, even if it's a pachas mikabetza, even a minimal shir, we'll learn behemshech is mekabel according to the Rambam tumas ochlin. In order to be matami something else, you have to have a kashir. The kashir to be matami something else, a kabetza. Now, what happens if you have this piece, which is less than a kazayas of an avela? So now this less than kazayas and avela could be matami tumas ochlin, could become tami tumas ochlin without hechsher because it's safe l'tama with a kazayas. Now, what happens if to this pachas mikazayas you will mitzaref other ochlin? And now they're all together a kibetza, and now they're being makabel tumah from something else, and now they want to transmit the tumah weiter. So l'chure bishleim, this less than a kazayas of the nevela didn't need hechsher because it's safer l'tam and tumah chamura b'kazayas. But l'chure the rest of it, which was nitztarev to it, l'chure they weren't part of that nevela. So l'chure they do need hechsher, and that's the chiddush over here. The chiddush over here is that when you have other eichel, it's mitzaref with eichel which doesn't need hechsher, that eichel also doesn't need hechsher. Psachidush. Halacha vav. Pachis mikazayis minivlas behemat tmeya shechishav olav, and now it has a din of eichel. So this nivlas behemat tmeya has a din of eichel, and now v'hishlam olav kibetza ma'eichlam acherim. Now you took other eichel, and you were mashlim that these other eichel should be together with that pachis mikazayis, and together it should be a kibetza. So the din is ein hakel tzarech hechsher. This entire kibetza, which is comprised of, first of all, the pachas mikazayas of the nivlas behemat tmeya shechishav olav, and the other foods don't need hechsher. Why? Because hayalu pachas mikazayas shebechol habetza. The pachas mikazayas which is in this betza, im hishlima likazayas doch metame tumah chamura. This pachas mikazayas has in it this thing that in Mishlim Malikazayas will be Metame Tumah Chamura, so that causes that everything that's connected to it also doesn't need hechsher. That's this din. V'chein Kazayas Menivlas Behemat Tmeya Shechishav Olav. You had a Kazayas of a Nivlas Behemat Tmeya which is Chishav Olav, and V'hinich. So l'chura, if it's an avela, so there's no inyan of being Metame Tumas Ochlin over here. So over here we have to have a Chetimtza where it's Negeya that it's Metame Tumas Ochlin. Over here is Negeya Azay. You took this kizayas of a nivlas behemat tmeya, which is be'etzem metame itself, it's an avatuma. A kizayas of a nivlas behemat tmeya is the chanavatuma, and you put it, you wrapped it in dough. And now this whole piece of meat wrapped in dough is together a kibetza. The meat is a kizayas, and with the dough it's a kibetza. Now lepel. If you're going to go ahead and touch this dough, which is wrapped around this nevela, so you're not going to become tummy. Pashtus, you're not going to become tummy. Why? Because you didn't touch the nevela. If you move it, so the pale nevela is matam mago mamasa. So memela, if you move it, so it's considered you carried it. Masha'inkin, if you only touch it, you're not going to be tummy. So you're saying hoyel ve'ini matam b'masa v'inicha b'batzik al sheishim l'kabetza. Hoyel ve'ini matam b'maga mepnei abatzik. So therefore, harezet tzarech machshava. You need machshava in order for it to become tamei tumas ochlin. Because with nivlas behemat tmeya doesn't become tamei tumas ochlin. Normally we speak about it when it's less than a kazayas, but over here it's a kazayas. But lepel, since it's wrapped, so memela there's an inyan of being metamei tumas ochlin. Is harezet tzarech machshava. So it needs machshava in order to give it a din that it's mekabel tumas ochlin. However, this basik doesn't need hechsher. Why? Because hail v'chol ashir hazeh. Because when you take a look at this basik with the basar in it, is that metame b'masa mepnei k'zayis nevela shebetechei aval pi she'ena metame b'maga aber sefer l'tame tumah chamura l'fichein tzarech hechsher. So therefore, lepel mamish comes out the halacha is azoi that if you have this basar which is an avela of a behemat tmeya, and it's wrapped in dough. Now this basar of nevela behemat tmeya, lepel right now, if someone's going to go ahead and touch it, the pashtus, he won't become tummy from the nevela because he didn't touch the nevela. If he's going to go pick it up, he'll become tummy because he was nesid in avela. If he'll move it, he'll become tummy. Now the din is that the dough with the basar which is in it, if there was a machshava on the basar, has a din of oichel, and that oichel is mekabel tumah. That oichel is mekabel tumah, and once it's mekabel tumah, it can be metame acherim because it's a kabetza. Now he's saying that in order for it to be mekabel tumah, it doesn't have to have hechsher. So in other words, if you have, let's say, this piece of dough that was never muksher lekabel tumah, it was never muksher lekabel tumah, it never touched water, it was made with apple juice. And memela, so the dough here, you have a dough and the piece of meat, and it's a kibetza. So if someone that's tummy will touch this dough, so memela, it'll become now this whole dough with the basar inside, which is a kazayas of psar nevela, a nevela of a behemoth tmeya. It'll become tummy, Tumas Ochlin. And now when this dough with the thing inside will go ahead and touch something else, so it'll be matami oichel, because it's a kibetza, kibbutz matami oichel. So that's like a chidush over here, that you have something which is an avela, and it's a kazayis an avela, and but else the kazayis an avela is matam maga b'masa, but without maga it's not going to be matami. Masha'inkin, it could be mitzdaref to the dough in order to be matami Tumas Ochlin. It becomes matami Tumas Ochlin, and the chidush is that since there's the kazayis of this nevela inside, so the dough doesn't have to have its own hechsher. Yeah. Halacha zayin pachis mikazayis mipsar hames. Shehishel molov kibetza mishar Ochlin. The same tzir, like we said before, is akel tzarech mashava. You need machshava. Shari bottle akel etzel kolodam, because a normal person wouldn't want to eat this. A normal person wouldn't want to eat food that became nitztaref to psar adam. So therefore, everything needs machshava. You have to have machshava to be miyached the adam. Just like we said before, that when you have psar ames, before we spoke about psar nevela, so that psar nevela, which is part of this mixture, doesn't need hechsher. So everything else, which was nitztaref to it, also doesn't need hechsher. So al derazeh, by the psar ames, doesn't need hechsher. So by the nevela, the fact that you took, the nevela needed machshava, but the isa, which was around the nevela, didn't need machshava. The isa is regular food. Over here, the chiddush is that since we're dealing with psar hames, a mess of a person, so a normal person wouldn't want to eat food that was nitztaref to psar hames. So in order for it to have a din of oichel, to be makabel Tumas Ochlin, we're talking about the psar hames together with the oichel that are all being makabel Tumas Ochlin. So in order for that to be makabel Tumas Ochlin, you need machshav. Halacha ches kizayis min hames shechipo bebotzek is akil mistamit tumah chamura. Everything is mistamit tumah chamura. There's no musik of anything that's not going to be tam tumah chamura, because when you touch an avela, so you're not tamei. Only when you're neisa is an avela. Mashenkin by a mess, it's also metamei be oil. So memela, when you go ahead and touch it, so bepashas, you're putting your hand over it. So then you're mistamit tumah chamura. The question is, l'churi, there can be a hechatimsa. You can have psar mess in open air, not in open air, and you touch it on the side. So if you touch it on the side, so then it's not l'chura mistamet tumah chamura. You have to l'chura tzarech bir. Halacha tes hachoyter basar mi adam chai lachilav lekelef is im chishiv olav l'maychal adam harei tzarech machshav. It's not very clear the lashon. The way the Ram Baruch is mefarish comes out that you need chishav olav l'maychal adam in order to give it a din of maychal adam. And harei tzarech machshava. In other words, this chishav is tzarech machshava, because bepashtus it's not l'maychal adam. However, ve'eni tzarech hechsher, this basar doesn't need hechsher. Why? Because seifa l'tamid tumah chamura. Now, how seifa l'tamid tumah chamura? L'chura, because the person knows, even though the person's alive, but when the person will die, so it'll be l'tamid tumah chamura. So memela, this flesh was part of a person that was seifa l'tamid tumah chamura. It's like a new din in seifa l'tamid tumah chamura. It was part of a person that if that person will die, so it'll be seifa l'tamid tumah chamura. The problem is that l'chura einachinami. At that point in time, he was taka seifa l'tamid tumah chamura, but at that point in time, he wasn't oichel. As we learned before, that the hechsher needs after it was oichel, and also needs that seifa l'tamid tumah chamura after it's oichel. Like we had Benigea the Eva Menachai. The Eva Menachai. We had it by Eva Menachai. So if he had in mind that it should be oichel before he cut off the basar, so it already had a din of oichel, and it had a din of oichel which doesn't need hechsher. So mele, now when you cut off the basar, it also doesn't need hechsher. Mashenkin the Adam, when the person was alive, he didn't have a din of oichel. And now, he was safe for the tamatum mechamura, but he didn't have a din of oichel. Now, when you cut it off, al minas to lachile la'adam, so l'chura good. At that point in time, it becomes a din of oichel. But at that point in time, l'chura, it's not safe for the tamatum mechamura. That's something which l'chura tzorich and the Ram Baruch brings all arichos from achreinim to answer pshat in this. It's a shtickle deal. Halacha yud goizel shenafel legas v'mes. A geyser, it's a kosher bird that fell into a gas. A gas is a place where you press wine. It's full of wine, and it died. In Aval Pisha gas b'Medina, and normally the din is that the nevela of an Eiftor doesn't need machshava b'Medina, but nevertheless, hari nimas begas, it's nimas begas, lefichach tzarich machshava. So now this geyser doesn't need hechsher. The reason is bepashtos. First of all, it's in the wine, but lepel it doesn't need hechsher because it's safe l'tamatum mechamura. It's nivlas eifator. Masha'inkin machshava, nivlas eifator doesn't need machshava b'Medina, but over here, when it was nafal legas, it's tzarich machshava. That's the chiddush. Nachishav aluk shehaleu lachile lenachri. When you took it out of the gas, in your mind was that you're going to give it to a guy to eat. Is that reason matame? Because lepel, that's considered chishav la'adam. Shari chishav alav meichel adam. Chishav alav lachile lekelev is einim mistame Tumas Ochlin, because lepel, it wasn't mistake. You didn't chishav alav l'adam. It's einim mistame Tumas Ochlin. It still has a din of nivlas eifator, which is matame beis abliyah, but it's not matame Tumas Ochlin. Now, hoyen zeh shechishav alav lachile li'adam cher sheitev v'katan. So then is arei Torah, because lepel, the machshava v'cher sheitev v'katan doesn't happen, doesn't work. He doesn't have a din machshava. So mele the machshava v'cher sheitev v'katan can't give it a din of miyuchad l'adam. However, hechile kedei lachile l'adam, if he was, when he picked it up, it was kedei lachile l'adam. Because he said clearly, he picked it up, and while he picked it up, he was saying clearly that it's kedei lachile l'adam. So the din is when a cher sheitev v'katan does a ma'isa, and he's mefarish pshat in his ma'isa, so then it has a din. His machshava does help, because that's pshat in his ma'isa. So hechelu kedei lachile l'adam. So then it's arei Tommy. Then it is metame Tumas Ochlin, where sheyesh lehem ma'isa and lehem machshava. Machshava is tamazay they don't have. But if it's a ma'isa, the ma'isa with the machshava knows the dibur is mefarish the ma'isa, so then it has a din. Their machshava does have.